Hello, everyone. So thank you for taking the time to attend this presentation. So for those who don't know me, I'm the online technologist for LSC Kingwood, which means I'm the LMS support person, basically technology support for the faculty at LSC Kingwood. And before getting started, I wanted to kind of provide a little bit of context into why I decided to do this presentation in the first place. So my primary role involves working one-on-one with faculty every day, right? And there are some faculty members who come to me frequently, and some of them only come to me at certain times of the year. But regardless, I have conversations with all of them, and I wanted to put something together that kind of addresses the concerns that many instructors have. Even though my role is really more on the side of technology support, as opposed to the type of content which I'm going to be showing you today, which is really more on the side of instructional design, if anything. Um, and I wanted to create a presentation where I basically cover two ideas, which is I'm going to start by going over some ideas I've gathered, which are designed to safeguard integrity of education. So these would be things that you can do to discourage the unauthorized use of AI. And I'll later move on to ideas that how students can maybe use AI. So I'll be covering kind of both sides of you know, whatever you fall on. So here's the agenda. So I'm going to start by going over some basic things about AI, and then I'm going to start going into making writing assignments less acceptable. And then I'm going to talk about some additional ideas. And then I'm going to move on to a few suggestions, like I say, about how students can maybe use it, so that you can maybe promote those ideas, or maybe so that they can at least get you thinking of ways that your students can use them. And the content of my presentation was basically suggested by faculty, because I sent out a survey a few months ago, where I asked faculty members, what type of content are you interested in seeing? What do you want to know more about on the topic of AI? The majority of instructors seem to be interested a little bit more in finding ways to safeguard integrity and kind of detect it and things. So most of my content is kind of catering to that request. Um, so just to give a little context into that. So some basic things to know. Before getting started, I wanted to kind of take a moment to briefly go over some basic things about chatbots, basically because all faculty members don't have the same level of familiarity with AI, and I wanted to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about some kind of basic things. So some of you may already know all these things. So if you do, just bear with me for a little bit. But AI chatbots prioritize factual accuracy over original insight and personal voice by default. So I say this just to provide a little bit of insight into what AI responses are typically like. Keep in mind their primary function of AI is to provide information and complete tasks. So by default, their responses concentrate more on providing facts in their writing. And their writing contains no personal voice. And on top of that, they have filters in place to avoid accidentally generating responses that reflect any kind of opinions or biases, because they're generally more optimized for objectivity. That's not to say that the responses will never contain any biases, because occasionally they accidentally do. And that's because AI chatbots are mostly trained on mass amounts of internet content, right? Where biases and opinions are common. So that's why those filters were built in the first place. And some of that does occasionally get through, even when unprompted. Of course, their responses can become personalized if a student explicitly instructs the AI to write a paper with a certain voice. But again, their responses kind of lack that kind of writer's voice that typically appears when a person writes a paper. And normally there's little to no expressions, metaphors, no typos for that matter. Not to suggest that it's easy to identify it. I'm just kind of talking about the default way in which it writes. But anyhow, just because they prioritize facts, that doesn't mean that they are always correct, because they can generate factually incorrect or misleading information. So again, AI chatbots are susceptible to misinformation for the same reason. It's called hallucinations, and that vulnerability again comes from, like I said, the data set that it's trained on, mostly consisting of internet content. they don't have the ability to kind of fact check information and provide, the information that it provides, it can't fact check it. So even though the responses do contain a lot of accurate information a lot of the time, they may also contain incorrect or even outdated info. So I just say this just to warn people a little bit before they decide to rely on them too much. I think it's just important to note this in case you didn't know. Um, some have access to current information. So what that really means is that they have access to, some of them, regularly refresh training data that kind of allows them to know about current news and events that happened on the same day, if that news or those events have a significant online presence. But regardless how much internet data it has, they have limitations to accurately cite their work. Um, the way in which generative AI kind of generates responses kind of makes it impossible to do so. On a very basic level, they generate responses based on word association. So if you ask it a question, for example, it responds by putting together a response one word at a time that sort of follows the general type of answer that your question normally receives that sounds correct based on its training data. So you can't tell it to write a paper and be sure to include some accurate and like relevant in-text citations for you throughout the paper, along with like a fully accurate works cited page at the end, and have it do all of that successfully. As far as I know, none of them out there can really do that. So let me go. All right, so we'll always be able to brainstorm ideas for any assignment prompt. So it's important to note that no prompt is completely 100% foolproof against AI. Students will, of course, always be able to use AI as a brainstorming tool. And of course, using it as a brainstorming tool in itself is, generally okay. But nevertheless, you can make writing assignments less susceptible because they struggle with complex questions and tasks. So AI chatbots are good at processing and generating information, so they rely on recognizing patterns in data and to make predictions and generate responses. So the more complex your question is, which requires a higher level of thinking or maybe like a nuanced understanding of something, the more it will likely struggle to really to generate a really well-rounded response, and the more of like a surface level response you'll get. So there are a lot of factors at play when talking about the level of complexity an assignment idea has. So to help illustrate what I mean, I'm going to move on to my next slide. So what makes an assignment prompt susceptible? So the first thing you would want to do if you're interested in safeguarding the integrity of a writing assignment against AI is to start with the assignment prompt itself. So this is one thing: lack of specification, vague instructions, or topics which are too broad. So remember, when it comes to writing prompts, giving your students too much freedom about what to write about opens the door to generic and unoriginal responses. And those are the type of responses that AI is particularly good at producing. So these are, something that you want to stay away from. Unoriginal prompts, overused themes or topics many others have already written about. So you want to stay away from cliche responses as much as you can, because remember, AI chatbots learn to generate responses from all of that internet content. So if you assign your students an assignment prompt that many others have already written about, odds are the AI will be able to produce a really well-written response for it very easily. So the more generic the topic, the more easily AI can generate a great response. That's not to say that you have to have the most original idea every single time you want to give an assignment. It's just that you want to stay away from cliche kind of general, or sorry, not general, generic ideas, as much as possible. Fact-based prompts, requesting descriptions or overviews of well-documented figures, places, events, etc. So I think it's best to kind of leave assessments that mainly involve reciting facts to proctored quizzes or exams, or some other form of assessment. If you're worried about students using AI to write papers, it's especially not a good idea to have an assignment prompt that's basically all about describing things like this, because whether it's a person, a place, a movie, a book, anything like that, you know the AI will be able to produce an original and a fairly well-written response for things like that, you know, all day. So carefully consider your assignment prompts. So all that said, when you're creating an assignment prompt, consider creating assignment prompts which require a combination of. So a lot of you are probably already including a lot of these elements in your assignment prompts already. Um, and if you do, that's a good thing. You might be surprised that not everyone does, unfortunately, or not always at least. But you would want to create an assignment prompt that includes a combination of elements like this, not just one or the other, given that it's appropriate for your topic. So just to go through these, critical thinking and evaluation. So of course, very basic thing. You generally want students to analyze information from and form their own judgment and defend it with evidence, as opposed to just static assessments with sort of fixed answers. Analysis of multiple aspects or perspectives. So this is to prevent service level responses. Basically, the more multifaceted your question is, the better. Experiments, fieldwork, or collecting and analyzing data. Um, in other words, real world applications, right? And you don't need to be teaching in the sciences to incorporate this into your assignment. I have some kind of examples that kind of demonstrate this of what this, what that can look like. Um, sorry, I lost my place here. Reference to specific content not available online. So what I mean by this is requiring students to reference material that you're familiar with, like your own course content or maybe paywall content from a course book or maybe library database material. Not that there are ways around that, to be honest, because of course students can copy and paste things. But I have an example of what this can look like on the next slide as well. But at any rate, the point of what I'm talking about is not, again, to make the assignment 100% AI proof, just because, like I said, that's nearly impossible. But this is just to make things less susceptible. Reference to recent events not widely reported. So just because if you want to have your students write a reflection paper about a real life event, it's better to have them write about something that happened recently, preferably, something that didn't receive a whole lot of internet attention, maybe, because that means the AI won't have as much reference material or context about it to easily kind of generate a well-written analysis for it straight away. uh, Reference to direct quotes. So I suggest this just because if you ask AI to generate quotes, not only can it get them wrong, but your students will also have to actually, accurately cite that quote and give you a reliable source telling you where it came from, which again, the AI isn't really capable of doing. So if students are asked to include relative quotes that back up what they're talking about throughout the paper, they can't just kind of collect random quotes that serve no purpose to what they're talking about and stick them randomly in their writing. Or I mean, at least if they do, you'll probably notice something odd about that, or you'll notice it. So again, doesn't make it 100% AI proof, but that's just a good an additional layer to add. Um, and personal insights, opinions, solutions, and or experiences. So just real quick, you wouldn't want your assignment to only focus on a student telling you about a personal experience, just because it can give you examples. So if a student asks for an example, it can generate something like that. So you would want to have an assignment that requires something else in it, like a deep analysis of some concept or idea, where you make the student tie in a personal experience to it. So, including elements like this can kind of, you know, um, help in this situation. And I have on this next slide some example prompts to illustrate what I mean. Um, so I have three different subjects here that I'm going to show you, or examples for three different subjects. And these are merely to give people ideas. So for each subject, I have two assignment prompts. The first one for each subject is not very specific. It's a little bit generic, and therefore it's more susceptible to AI. And the second prompt for each subject is an edited version of the same prompt, altered kind of in a way to make it less vulnerable. So composition and rhetoric. Write a convincing argument on whether we rely too much on our phones. So the first prompt is relatively straightforward. It, might be interesting for an assignment, but it asks for an opinion on a broad topic. So to make it less susceptible, what you can maybe do is do something like that's illustrated on the second prompt there. Track your phone usage across communication, social media, news, entertainment for 2 weeks. How did these habits impact your mood, focus, social interactions, and sleep? Evaluate and describe how your habits might be having a positive or negative impact on your psychological or cognitive well-being. So the second prompt basically asks the same question, but instead it's more personal and involved. And you would, of course, ask your students to submit the data log with something like this. And maybe this isn't the best example topic, but the point is that you can do something kind of similar to this in case you have a prompt that's very general or open to interpretation. You can require your students to collect and evaluate data of some kind, given that it's appropriate for your topic and if it's possible for your topic, so that they're not just answering general questions anymore, but you're having them experiment and do some kind of critical thinking involved with that. All right, so the next one, Texas government. Describe the role of public opinion, interest groups, and political parties in Texas politics. So the first one is ultimately asking for a straightforward explanation, really. An alternative approach would be something like, how does this news story, and that's a link to a news story, of course, demonstrate how the Republican Party uses public opinion to attempt to shape the political landscape of Texas? Do you agree with Greg Abbott's border policy? Explain why or why not. Lastly, how does this news story tie in with what we covered during week 2? So the second prompt asks students to reference a specific recent event via a news story as an example to watch, analyze, and reflect on. And the response is basically, it's the same question, not to mention the AI wouldn't, or um, it's the same question, just kind of made in a way where, it requires the student to do more work. Not to mention the AI wouldn't know what the students are kind of doing during the previous week. So you can maybe even record your own lectures, record your own lecture videos of your course and have your students kind of reference those and discuss what you kind of cover in them. And that might be another strategy to kind of do, something kind of like this. Environmental biology, discuss the long-term impact of society's lifestyle choices on the environment. So the first prompt is kind of similar to the first Texas government prompt in that it's asking for a straightforward explanation, and it can be kind of easily Googled. So that's, if your prompt can be easily Googled, um, that means that it's kind of vulnerable, right? So the second prompt, identify and research a specific environmental issue facing your town, county, or city, such as pollution of a nearby river, air quality, local deforestation, the impact of an invasive species, etc. Research and evaluate this issue's causes and consequences for the local ecosystem, then describe how and why these consequences may directly impact you. Propose strategies to help resolve or mitigate this issue. Sorry, so the second prompt is yet another route you can take, which is to basically be real specific and focus on critical thinking. So, think about this one. It involves finding like a local real world environmental problem that's relevant to them, evaluate the circumstances that caused it, explain how and why it happened, give insights into different ways of how and why it might affect them personally, and then ask them to propose strategies to mitigate it. So it's a prompt that, you know, if the students wanted to give you a good response to this, they would actually have to put in some time into it. And on top of all this, instead of merely having students submit a paper, you can maybe have your students submit a brief video as well, which is something that I'm going to cover in a little bit. So establish checkpoints. This is a suggestion that is more appropriate for instructors who maybe don't have a lot of students because it requires some extra work. But some instructors are basically already doing something similar to this. But an action you can take is, instead of simply giving your students an assignment and a deadline, you can maybe establish checkpoints for your assignments as well. And the reason I'm suggesting this is because while there are many reasons why a student may resort to academic dishonesty, this strategy directly addresses one of them, which is by giving them an opportunity to kind of know how well they're doing before submitting their work. Um, and not only will it give you insight into their writing process in order to help guide them, but students will also see that you're doing everything you can to ensure that they succeed in your course. And one reason for doing this, among other reasons, is that it will help create an atmosphere where students feel like they can be open um, about their work and if they're using AI or not. So, granted, it's a strategy that maybe wouldn't be appropriate for every writing assignment, but I think it can work in certain circumstances. So, first thing, students submit outlines and drafts. So you can inform your students maybe that you're going to be collecting their work maybe halfway between the day that the assignment is given and the deadline. Um, so just so you can critique it according to what you're going to be evaluating. And on top of that, you have students report their progress. So maybe you can create a series of questions, like a survey, consisting of something like maybe 5 questions, for example, and maybe start with a general question like, how is your progress going so far? And also include questions like, can you briefly outline your main points? What sources are you using? And why did you choose them? What areas are you maybe struggling with that that I can help with? So you would ask relevant questions that kind of gauge how they're doing, and instructors can then look at those questions or their responses to those questions and provide feedback. So this is why I say it's more ideal for instructors who maybe don't teach many courses or students. I mean, some of you may have teaching assistants who can maybe help you with this as well. Um, but you give each student feedback, ideally not only pointing out the areas that they need to improve, but also pointing out things they did well. And you can ask them, why not, or some instructors might wonder, like, why not have them reach out to me when they need help? Not to mention that I also realize that there's platforms out there like IntelliWriter that are meant to help students write a well-written paper. Um, but the reason why I suggest this is because even though some students aren't shy about sending emails whenever they have any sort of question, some students don't reach out, even though when they probably should. And some of them don't always use all the resources available to them. But the main point of something like this is to promote a more open and collaborative online learning environment. And you can tell your students to be honest with you about whether or not they're using AI as a brainstorming tool. Um, but doing this can you can more easily gauge how your students are kind of progressing, and it kind of helps establish honesty with your students. Um, and then, your students would submit your assignment. So introduce oral and video presentations. So this is an idea that I basically kind of read about online and I tweaked it a little bit. It's sort of a different approach, sorry. Incorporate presentations where students present their findings and explain their research process. Have students explain. So the reason why I suggest this is because one tried and true method for encouraging students to learn um, math, for example, with limited or even no help from a calculator is to require those students to show their work. And a similar approach can be taken for writing assignments by having them talk out their writing process as either a separate assignment or maybe as part of the assignment itself, in order to kind of promote accountability and transparency in their research and writing process, while also kind of reinforcing some of that critical thinking. So you would have them explain, starting with number one, how they went about selecting and evaluating their chosen sources. Um, by having them explain to you how they decided what sources to use, it lets you gauge your students' ability to find credible and relevant information, how they learned, what they learned from each individual source while pointing out where they located key info. So during the presentation of this video that they make, they can maybe share their screen and pull up a website or a source they used one by one and kind of briefly sum up what they learned from that particular source. Maybe even kind of point out like the quotes and things like that that they included in their writing or the key points they incorporated into their writing, how they integrated information from different sources to build an overall thesis. So, you can have them explain how they interpreted all the research and how they integrated that information to validate their overall point of view. Again, you know, this can also help you evaluate the depth of a student's critical thinking because having students explain their thought process behind how they acknowledge or interpret information from different sources provides insight into how well they consider diverse perspectives, challenges or obstacles encountered during research and how they address them. So you can maybe ask them to tell you about the areas in the research that they found difficult, because this can kind of help you understand where they might be struggling and enables you to kind of maybe tailor your teaching and address, specific gaps in their understanding and whatnot. Finally, you can maybe ask this last question as well, if it's appropriate, how they plan to apply the knowledge gained from research in a practical or real world context. So, um, but this kind of encourages students to see the broader implications of their work and allows them to connect the dots to how they can use their research skills in kind of a practical manner. And again, they would also talk about, of course, throughout this presentation, like what they would cover the topic that you wanted them to write about, but I'm saying that they can also hit on these points specifically as well. So free to use AI detection tools. So as long as we're talking about AI, we have to talk about detectors. And I had a lot of hope for AI detectors when they first came out because they seemed to be pretty accurate when I tested them, or at least some of them were. Um, and we would also hear that they were just in the starting phases. So they would, improve is what people would say. But the truth is that they have too many flaws to be solely relied on as a means to determine if a student used AI. Um, Not only in that they can report false negatives, which means that uh, AI writing could sneak by kind of undetected, but they can also report false positives, which means that the student writing might be mistakenly identified as AI written. Um, and some instructors have taken the approach of using several detectors rather than just using one to analyze each submission. So that's not a terrible idea, but what you have to keep in mind is that some of these detectors work more or less the same. So if one detector, for example, reports a false positive, odds are that others will too. And this is just because they all work similarly to one another. And at times they can create the illusion that you're on to something when really they all share similar flaws. Remember, it basically writes by predicting the word that most likely um, is to precede it when it looks at the previous word that came before it. And the key behind detecting if text is AI written is for the detector to look at the sequence of words on the page and analyze the predictability of the sequence of those words. So there's some problems with that. Newer versions of chatbots produce text that is harder for those to detect. Um, and in case you didn't know, if you mess with the sequence of those words, for example, pasting the text into a paraphraser bot, which those do exist, that messes up the sequence and it bypasses any detector. Um, that's not to say that you flat out shouldn't use them, because I have heard some instructors have successfully discovered written papers thanks to them. So in an extreme scenario, if you scan a student's paper through a bunch of these and they say that the paper is 100% AI written, then, of course, in that circumstance, maybe you might want to follow up with the student. But it's really hard to give kind of like a general threshold percentage of what to look out for, just because there's many factors in place. So possible indicators. So because detectors are unreliable at detecting AI writing, some instructors have asked if several detectors report a relatively high AI score, but I can't rely on that alone, what else can I make me look for? So I wanted to do some research into that question. I searched for strategies online and I talked to some instructors, and the truth is it's hard to tell. There isn't any one specific magic thing that you can look for. If anything, you need a multifaceted approach, meaning that you need to maybe look for multiple signs that include, or sorry, that would be included in the paper that could indicate the possibility of using AI. And what I've done on this side is compile a few of those key things you can maybe look for, which I call possible indicators, but emphasis on the word possible because I'm not suggesting that any one of these things alone is proof of any wrongdoing. The idea is to maybe find several of them. But even if all of these things I'm about to mention on this paper, if you find them all on the same paper, it's still not 100% surefire proof that or evidence that the student used AI. It might indicate that, it might not. So then, why am I showing you this? Because, well, for one thing, it's something that was asked, and I think it's nevertheless worth mentioning. But ultimately, as an instructor, you would have to kind of, be the judge of you know of what you find is because you know the student and you know the context of the paper. So awkward transitions between ideas. So um, AI responses are only as good as the prompts that someone gives it, right? So if a student simply produces, or if a student simply provides a topic for an AI to write about, the AI isn't necessarily going to be concerned about ensuring that the paper it produces reads as a competently arranged composition with a coherent train of thought, from start to finish. It reads it as an input just, to provide information about something. So the piece of writing it produces may not transition very well from one idea to the next or from one paragraph to the next. The response may cover some good points, but as far as the flow is concerned, it may feel like the writer went out and collected a bunch of information and kind of lumped it together, as opposed to when a student truly takes the time to process and kind of flesh out his or her own thoughts. The writing tends to have a more natural flow because student is kind of working through their own argument, or their own thesis. Overly generic formal tone, lacking personality and emotions. So the more you use AI, the more you kind of become familiar with the tone and the style that it kind of tends to write with. It tends to generate writing that lacks emotional depth and creativity. Um, just like the previous indicator, this alone isn't a strong enough sign. Not to mention, students can instruct the AI to write with a certain tone to make it kind of harder to spot. So let's keep going. Analysis, which goes significantly beyond course content. So to kind of explain this, remember the massive data sets that the or chatbots are trained on. AI responds, AI responses might lack the context that's relevant to the specific focus and scope of your class. So that's kind of what I mean. It's if a student's analysis goes significantly beyond the information or the concepts covered so far in your course material, like an analysis that kind of contains a lot of complex terms that you never mentioned, or a specific historical or scientific background information that you never covered, things like that. It might indicate that the student had outside help of some kind. But to be fair, it might also indicate that the student, is just very knowledgeable. So again, it's all about the context of the situation. Consider the student's overall performance. So to give you an example of what I mean by this, uh, let's say that you're an English instructor and you have your students read a novel like The Canterbury Tales, and you have your students submit an analysis paper on it. and you have one student who gave you an excellent paper where they demonstrated a deep understanding. And then let's say you gave that same class and that same student a proctored exam on the same book, and that same student fails. So that's one example, um, where you can kind of analyze this. Granted, it won't always be that obvious, um, but it's just another thing to kind of maybe look out for. Fake or inaccurate citations. Um, no matter what, it's a good idea to check citations because depending on the platform that they use, uh, that platform can sometimes provide an article which you won't find if you attempt to Google it. Other times, it can provide a real article if you ask it to provide citations, but the quote that is attributed to that article doesn't actually appear in it. So last one, sudden shifts in writing style. You don't want to out students who submit genuine writing and are just making honest mistakes, but sometimes students will mix in their own genuine writing with AI generated writing, and this can in turn create inconsistencies in writing style. So again, this is what I found when I did like research into this question. These are additional things you can maybe look for in the writing in case you perhaps did receive a paper that reports a high AI writing detection score. Um, I nevertheless think the key is to create less susceptible assignments instead. Um, but
George, this
anyhow,
is
these
your
are things.
5 minute warning.
Sorry.
This is your 5 minute warning before
Oh,
your
okay.
time's up.
Um, So when in doubt, ask questions virtually or over the phone. I hope no one ever has to resort to doing this, but nevertheless, this is a suggestion that I saw appear multiple times online when researching what instructors can do when they have strong reasons to believe that a student used AI to write their papers. So I think if you ask a student about whether they use AI to write a paper, if you approach them the right way, most of the time they'll be honest. So this is something that should be resorted to as a worst case scenario. Um, Mind you, you could even do something kind of similar to my video presentation idea if you do kind of have doubts. Um, but the reason behind these questions that came up is because let's say if you decide to write or you decide to use AI to write a paper, you generate a response from a chatbot, and then you might use a paraphraser bot to stay ahead of AI detectors. Um, you might read the paper over once to kind of check for major issues. You might edit it slightly and submit it. So if that's what you do, would you be able to recall the paper's main points, the sources that were referenced, et cetera? If you put in the time and effort into those things, you would. So that's the reason kind of expressed behind this. Um, I suppose in some cases, some students who plagiarize AI might be able to answer some of these questions anyway. But like I say, it's an idea that popped up on multiple sort of websites and research when I was doing my research. So I decided to share it for that reason. So now I want to kind of move on to other things you can do, other actions you can take to address AI no matter what subject you teach. The first one is obvious, and I'm sure many of you are already doing this. Clearly communicate expectations. So maybe not only mention what your expectations are, but why you have them, and not just the obvious reasons why it's not acceptable to plagiarize, but as an educator, you might want to help them understand AI's potential benefits and drawbacks, and maybe emphasize its weaknesses, like how AI chatbots struggle with complex or ambiguous questions, because having more transparency about reasons behind things like this can help build understanding. Because when you only inform people of the consequences of doing something without going into reasons, it can lead into misunderstandings and even, conflict. So it's good to have those discussions with students. Um, keep in mind the several underlying reasons why students might consider cheating in the first place. Reasons like feeling overwhelmed with schoolwork or struggling to understand the material. Um, you know, things like that. You want to create a supportive environment so that students feel like they can be open and honest. And one way to kind of help create that is through communication. So educate students about academic integrity.